The courtroom was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat. I sat at the long wooden table with my hands folded in my lap, my fingers laced together so tightly that my knuckles had gone white. The fluorescent lights above hummed with that low, indifferent buzz that courtrooms always seem to have. A sound that belongs to places where lives are decided, where families are broken apart by signatures and legal language, and the cold arithmetic of who gets what. I had been in many rooms like this over the course of my life. Rooms where decisions were made. Rooms where power shifted hands. But I had never sat in one feeling quite so alone and quite so certain of what was about to happen. Across the table, my children sat in a row. My children. The word still felt strange to me in that moment, like a word in a foreign language that I had spoken fluently for decades, and suddenly, without warning, had stopped understanding. There was Daniel, my eldest, 41 years old, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He had his father's jaw and his grandfather's eyes, sharp, calculating, always measuring the distance between where he was and where he wanted to be. Next to him sat Claire, 38, her blonde hair pinned back with surgical precision, her expression arranged into something that was supposed to look like grief, but read more like impatience. And then there was Nathan, my youngest, 35, who had the decency at least to avoid my eyes entirely, staring down at the table as though he might find some kind of absolution in the grain of the wood. Their lawyers sat beside them. 3 separate lawyers, for 3 siblings, against their mother. I had one lawyer, Margaret Chen, 62 years old, silver-haired with reading glasses that she wore on a chain around her neck, and a reputation in Los Angeles that made grown men nervous. She was the only person in that room, besides me, who knew what was inside the envelope. The envelope sat on the table in front of me. It was not a dramatic-looking thing, just a standard white business envelope, slightly yellowed at the corners from age, sealed with the kind of old-fashioned wax seal that my husband Richard had always loved. A small affectation of his. One of those quirky, romantic gestures that had made me fall in love with him 38 years ago, when we were both young and stupid, and full of the particular kind of hope that only the young can sustain without irony. The seal was dark red, the color of old wine. Pressed into it was the letter R, for Richard. He had pressed that seal himself 10 years ago, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in November, while I sat across from him at his desk in the study of our home in Bel Air, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold in my hands because I kept forgetting to drink it. I remembered the way he had looked up at me after he sealed it, with those gray eyes of his that had always seen straight through me, and said, "Jennifer, promise me you won't open this until the time is right." "How will I know when the time is right?" I had asked. He had smiled, that slow, quiet smile that I had loved for nearly 4 decades. "You'll know," he said. "You always know." Richard Thomas Caldwell had died 6 weeks ago. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed 14 months earlier, fought with the same quiet ferocity with which he had approached every obstacle in his life. He had not complained. He had not raged. He had simply, and this was so completely Richard, made arrangements. Methodical, careful, thorough arrangements. The way he did everything. I had been with him at the end. Just the 2 of us, the way he had wanted it. The children had been called, of course. They had arrived the day before, had stood in the doorway of his bedroom with the appropriate expressions of sorrow and love, had held his hands and kissed his forehead. But when the actual moment came, when the breathing changed and the room went still, it was just Richard and me. 38 years of marriage condensed into a single quiet moment, and then he was gone, and everything changed. If you're watching this, and you have ever lost a spouse, the person who was your home, your anchor, the fixed point around which your entire life orbited, then you know what those first hours feel like. That terrible, suspended feeling, like the world has not yet gotten the news and is still spinning at its normal speed while you stand perfectly still in the center of it. I sat beside his bed for a long time after, holding his hand, which was still warm. I did not cry. Not yet. I was too deep inside the shock for tears. It was Daniel who knocked on the door, and that knock, that particular knock, impatient, 3 sharp raps, the knock of a man who has somewhere to be, was the first sign of what was coming. But I am getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you about the courtroom, before I tell you about the envelope and what was inside it, and the way my daughter's face crumbled when Margaret slid the documents across the table, before all of that, I need to tell you about Richard, and about me, and about the life we built together, which was, despite everything that came after, the most extraordinary thing I have ever been part of. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please do it right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story is going to take you somewhere you are absolutely not expecting. And if you've ever been betrayed by someone you loved and trusted, leave a comment below and tell me, did you fight back or did you walk away? I want to know. Now let me take you back to the beginning. I was born Jennifer Marie Holloway in Pasadena, California, in 1958. My father was a civil engineer who built bridges, literal bridges, the kind that span rivers and canyons. And my mother was a high school English teacher who read poetry at the dinner table and believed, with an almost religious conviction, that language was the most powerful tool a human being could possess. I grew up in a house full of books and blueprints, which is perhaps why I turned out the way I did. Equal parts romantic and pragmatic, able to dream and to calculate in the same breath. We were not wealthy. We were comfortable in the way that professional families in the 1960s and 70s were comfortable. There was always food on the table. There were vacations to the beach in summer. There were piano lessons and new school shoes every fall. But there was no excess. My parents believed in earning what you had, in the dignity of work, in the particular satisfaction of looking at something and knowing that your own hands helped build it. I think about that a lot now. I went to UCLA on a partial scholarship studying economics, which was still a somewhat unusual choice for women in 1976. My advisor, a kind but limited man named Professor Hutchins, had actually suggested I consider switching to education. I politely declined. I had my father's stubbornness and my mother's language, and together, those two things had made me someone who did not change direction simply because a man with a briefcase suggested it. I met Richard in my junior year. He was a graduate student in business, 2 years older than me, tall and lean with dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that he was constantly pushing back with one hand. He was standing at the coffee cart outside Royce Hall on a Thursday morning in October, arguing, politely but with complete conviction, with another graduate student about the structural flaws in a particular investment model that had been published in the Wall Street Journal. I stopped walking. I don't know why, exactly. I had seen attractive men argue about finance before, but there was something about the way he argued, not to win, but to understand, not to dominate, but to get at the truth of the thing. That stopped me in my tracks. He noticed me noticing him. He turned, pushed the hair off his forehead, and said, "You look like someone who has an opinion." "I usually do," I said. "Good," he said, and smiled. "I'm Richard." We talked for 4 hours that day. We missed our respective classes entirely, and neither of us cared. By the time the sun started going down over the campus and the air turned golden and cool, I already knew, with the absolute certainty that only comes a few times in a life if you are lucky, that this was the person I was going to build my life with. We were married 3 years later, in June of 1981, in a small ceremony in my parents' backyard in Pasadena. My mother read a poem by Pablo Neruda. My father built the wedding arch himself, out of redwood and white roses. Richard's parents flew in from Boston, his father a retired judge, his mother a woman of extraordinary elegance and warmth, who took my hands in hers at the reception and said, "He has been waiting for someone exactly like you. Don't ever stop surprising him." I have thought about those words many times in the years since. The early years of our marriage were not easy, and I say that not as a complaint, but as a simple statement of fact, because I think it is important to be honest about the texture of a life, rather than smoothing it into something more palatable. Richard had an idea for a company, a real estate investment firm that would focus on commercial properties in underserved urban areas, a model that was considered eccentric in the early 1980s, when everyone else was chasing suburban developments and shopping malls. We had very little money. We had a 1-bedroom apartment in Koreatown, a second-hand Toyota Corolla, and a dining table that doubled as Richard's office. I was working as a financial analyst at a mid-sized firm downtown, bringing home a salary that paid the rent and not much more. We worked. That is the most accurate way I can describe those years. We worked with the kind of focused, almost joyful intensity that comes when you believe completely in what you are doing. Richard worked 18-hour days building his company from nothing, cold calling investors, walking properties in neighborhoods that his colleagues wouldn't set foot in, writing business plans by hand at our dining table, while I sat across from him going over spreadsheets. I contributed everything I had, not just financial analysis, but ideas, strategy, connections. Richard always said, and meant it, that Caldwell Capital was built by both of us. Daniel was born in 1983, Claire in 1986, Nathan in 1989. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, the diapers and the sleepless nights and the school plays and the soccer games and the terrifying, exhilarating lurch from broke to stable to comfortable to genuinely, undeniably wealthy. Somewhere in the middle of all of that, Richard's company became something remarkable. By the early 1990s, Caldwell Capital was managing a portfolio worth tens of millions of dollars. By 2000, it was hundreds of millions. The model that everyone had called eccentric turned out to be visionary. Urban commercial real estate in cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, Atlanta, and Houston exploded in value over those 2 decades, and Richard had gotten in early, gotten in smart, and stayed in when others panicked. We moved from Koreatown to Silver Lake to a house in Los Feliz, and finally, in 1997, to a 7,000-square-foot estate in Bel Air with a pool and a guest house, and a view of the city that made me catch my breath every single morning. For the 26 years we lived there. Our children grew up in that house. They went to the best private schools in Los Angeles. They had tutors and coaches and opportunities that neither Richard nor I had ever imagined as children. We gave them everything we could, not just material things, but time and attention and values. Or we tried to. We tried very hard. I wonder sometimes if we tried too hard in the wrong directions and not hard enough in the right ones. But I am getting to that. What I want you to understand before anything else is this. Richard and I were partners. That word, partners, does not fully capture what we were to each other, but it comes closer than most. We made decisions together. We argued, sometimes bitterly, but always in the direction of truth. We respected each other's intelligence. We were honest with each other in ways that were sometimes uncomfortable and always necessary. And the company, Caldwell Capital, the thing that Richard had dreamed up at our dining table in Koreatown, was as much mine as it was his, even though my name was not on the door. That arrangement had been my choice in the beginning. When the children were small, I had stepped back from the day-to-day operations to focus on them, and it had simply stayed that way as the years went on, and the company grew. I did not regret it. I had contributed enormously in the early years, and I had found deep satisfaction in raising our children and running our household, which was, with a 7,000-square-foot estate, and a staff of 4 and a constant rotation of business dinners and charity events and family obligations, itself a considerable enterprise. But I had never, for a single day, stopped paying attention. That is the thing my children forgot, or perhaps never knew. They saw a woman who attended galas and managed the household and sat beside their father at charity functions, and they mistook the graceful surface of my life for the entirety of it. They did not know, because Richard and I had never found it necessary to explain ourselves to our children, as couples of our generation rarely did, that I attended every major board meeting of Caldwell Capital from 1998 onward, that I had a law degree from Loyola, that I had completed part-time in the late 1980s, quietly, while Richard built the company, and I raised the children, because my mother had been right about language being the most powerful tool, and I had always understood that legal language was the sharpest blade of all, that I had, over the course of our marriage, accumulated in my own name a portfolio of investments and real estate holdings that was separate from Richard's, the result of careful, methodical planning that Richard and I had undertaken together for reasons that, at the time, had seemed perhaps overcautious. They did not seem overcautious now. The first sign came on the day Richard was diagnosed. He told me that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 glasses of bourbon, that neither of us touched. Pancreatic cancer, stage 2, caught relatively early, but still, as the oncologist had explained with the careful directness of someone who has delivered this kind of news many times. A serious and uncertain situation. Richard was characteristically calm. He asked the right questions. He had a plan for treatment within 48 hours. And then he said something that I have thought about every day since. "Jennifer," he said, looking at me across the table with those gray eyes, "I need you to promise me something." "Anything," I said. "I need you to be careful. With the children." He paused, choosing his words. "They love you. I believe that. But they also love this." He gestured, a small encompassing gesture that took in the house and everything it represented. "And I'm not certain, when it comes down to it, which one they love more." I looked at him. "Richard, I know," he said. "I know it's hard to hear, but I've watched them for a long time, Jennifer. I know things about Daniel and Claire especially that I have never told you because I did not want to worry you." He reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm telling you now because I need you to be ready. Whatever happens to me, I need you to be ready." I wanted to argue with him. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that our children were good people, that illness was making him suspicious and dark. I had spent 30 years defending my children against every ungenerous interpretation of their behavior, explaining away their sharpness, their occasional coldness, their tendency to measure relationships in terms of what they yielded. But sitting there in the kitchen with the bourbon untouched between us, I found that I could not, because somewhere deep inside me, in the place where we know the things we do not want to know, I already understood what he was telling me. So instead of arguing, I said, "Tell me everything." He told me. It took 3 hours. Richard had, with the same methodical thoroughness that he brought to everything, observed and documented certain behaviors over the years. Conversations he had overheard, financial questions that were inappropriate in their specificity, the way Daniel had casually begun positioning himself within the company's leadership structure, in ways that went beyond his actual role, the way Claire had cultivated relationships with the company's board members without mentioning it to either of us. Nothing illegal, nothing that, taken individually, amounted to much, but as a pattern, as a coherent long-term pattern of behavior, it told a story. The story it told was that my children had been preparing for their father's death for much longer than any of us had been aware that his death was imminent. I sat with that knowledge for 14 months. I sat with it through Richard's chemotherapy, through the good stretches and the bad ones, through Christmas and Thanksgiving and his last birthday in March, when the children came, and we sat in the garden, and the light was soft and golden, and Richard looked at each of them with an expression I could not entirely read, love and sorrow and something else, something harder, and said, "I am so proud of the people you've become." He looked at me when he said it. Only at me, and I understood. He died on a Monday in April. Quietly, as I have already told you, just the two of us. And then, the knock on the door. Daniel's knock, 3 sharp raps, impatient, came approximately 4 hours after Richard had taken his last breath. I was still sitting beside the bed. The hospice nurse had come and gone. The house was very still. I opened the bedroom door and there was Daniel in the hallway, not in grief clothes, but in the charcoal suit he had been wearing when he arrived the previous day, the jacket now removed and draped over his arm. He looked at me with his father's jaw and his grandfather's calculating eyes and said, "Mom, we need to talk about the estate." I looked at my son for a long moment. "Your father has been dead for 4 hours," I said. "I know that," Daniel said, "but there are things that need to be addressed, time-sensitive things. I've already spoken with our family attorney." "Your family attorney," I said quietly. "Or yours?" He blinked, a brief hesitation. "The families," he said. "Marcus Webb. You know Marcus." I knew Marcus Webb. I also knew that Daniel had been having private lunches with Marcus Webb for the past 8 months, because our housekeeper Carmen had mentioned it once in passing, not knowing it was significant, and I had filed it away in the place where I kept the things I was not yet ready to look at directly. "We'll discuss the estate when your father has been buried," I said. "Not before." "Mom!" "Not before, Daniel." I closed the door, but that was only the beginning. The funeral was held 6 days later at a small Episcopal church in Bel Air that Richard had attended since childhood whenever we were in Los Angeles. It was a beautiful service, full of the music he had loved, the particular slant of light through old stained glass windows that turns everyone in a church into something more than they usually are, the kind of quiet dignity that Richard would have approved of. The eulogies were given by his oldest friend, his business partner of 20 years, and Daniel. Daniel's eulogy was good. I will give him that. He spoke about his father's vision and integrity, about the lessons Richard had taught him about business and about life. He cried, real tears, I believe, because whatever else was true about my son, he had loved his father in his way, and the loss was real. I sat in the front pew with Claire on one side and Nathan on the other, and I held my grief inside me like something precious and fragile, and I did not cry until I was alone that night, and then I cried for a very long time. The reading of the will was scheduled for 2 weeks after the funeral, as per the terms of Richard's estate plan, which had been drawn up with the firm of Harrington and Associates, not Marcus Webb, 3 years before his diagnosis. I knew this because I had been present for every meeting with Harrington and Associates. I had, in fact, contributed substantially to the structure of the estate plan, working alongside Richard and the attorneys to craft something that was, as Richard had put it, careful. That was the word he used, careful. In the 2 weeks between the funeral and the reading, my children were careful too, carefully attentive to me, in ways that felt slightly performed, bringing me food and sitting with me in the evenings and asking if I needed anything. Daniel called every day. Claire came by the house 3 times. Nathan sent flowers. And they were also, less carefully, having conversations that they believed I could not hear. I have lived in that house for 26 years. I know every room in it, every hallway, every acoustic peculiarity. I know that sound travels from the back terrace through the kitchen and up the staircase with remarkable clarity. I know that the east guest room, where Daniel always stayed, is directly above the library where I spent most of my evenings in those weeks, sitting in Richard's chair with a glass of wine and his books around me. I heard Daniel on the phone with his attorney 3 nights after the funeral. She has no idea what the trust actually says. I had Marcus look at it. There's a provision that, if we contest it on the grounds of diminished capacity in the final years, we might be able to... A pause. No, I know it's a risk, but the way it's currently structured, she has majority control of the company voting shares. And that's not... Another pause. Just keep working on it. We have time. I sat very still in Richard's chair, and I listened to my son plan to contest his father's will on the grounds that Richard had been of diminished mental capacity, and I felt something settle inside me, something cold and clear and decided, like a key turning in a lock. I called Margaret Chen the next morning. The reading of the will, the formal official reading that took place in the conference room of Harrington and Associates in Century City, was, on the surface, unremarkable. Richard's estate was substantial. Caldwell Capital and all its holdings, the Bel Air property, 3 additional investment properties, a portfolio of stocks and bonds valued at approximately $40 million, assorted personal property, including art, jewelry, and vehicles. The will divided the estate as follows: 51% of Caldwell Capital's voting shares to Jennifer Caldwell. The remaining 49% split equally between the 3 children. The Bel Air property to Jennifer Caldwell outright. The investment properties to be managed within a trust for the benefit of all 4 family members. The cash portfolio split evenly between Jennifer Caldwell and the 3 children, meaning Jennifer received 25%, and each child received approximately 25% as well. It was, by any objective measure, an exceptionally fair distribution. Richard had taken care of everyone. Daniel did not see it that way. I watched his face during the reading. I watched the precise moment when the attorney read out that I held 51% of the company voting shares. The slim majority that meant, as a practical matter, that I controlled the company. And I watched something shift in his expression. The grief face, the attentive son face, simply slipped like a mask sliding sideways to reveal the face beneath. "That can't be right," he said. The attorney looked up. "I'm sorry." "That can't be right. My father would not have left controlling interest to my mother. She has no operational role in the company. She hasn't for years." The attorney looked at him steadily. "The will is quite clear, Mr. Caldwell." "I'd like a full copy of the trust documents," Daniel said. "Today." Claire was nodding. Nathan was looking at the table. I said nothing. I watched my hands, folded in my lap, and I thought about Richard pressing the red wax seal on that envelope, and I thought about him saying, "You'll know when the time is right." In the weeks that followed, my children moved from subtle maneuvering to open warfare with a speed that was, even given everything I knew and everything I had prepared for, still somehow shocking. It is one thing to intellectually understand that people you love are capable of betraying you. It is another thing entirely to watch it happen. Daniel filed a formal challenge to the will within 30 days, on the grounds, exactly as he had discussed on the phone that night, that Richard had shown signs of diminished cognitive capacity in the final years of his illness, and that the estate plan as currently structured did not reflect his genuine wishes. The attorney he used was not Marcus Webb, who apparently had enough professional scruples to decline, but a firm from downtown Los Angeles that specialized in estate litigation and had a reputation, as Margaret Chen told me calmly over the phone, for being extremely aggressive and not particularly ethical. Claire aligned herself with Daniel almost immediately. She had always been the more calculating of the two, the one who thought further ahead and kept her feelings more tightly controlled. And I suspected, correctly as it later turned out, that the strategy had originally been hers, and that Daniel was executing it with his characteristic impatience and bluntness, while Claire operated more quietly in the background. She retained her own attorney, separate from Daniel's, which gave the opposition 3 lawyers against my one. 3 lawyers, as I have already told you, whose clients sat across from me in that courtroom 6 weeks later. Nathan was the surprise. Of my 3 children, he had always been the one I felt I understood least. Quieter than his siblings, less defined, the one who had drifted through his 30s without the sharp ambition that characterized Daniel and Claire. He had his own consulting firm that depended, to a degree that I had always privately found troubling, on referrals and connections from his father's company. I had expected him to align with his brother and sister. Instead, he aligned with no one. He sat in the middle, avoided my eyes and his siblings' eyes equally, and said nothing publicly while the legal battle unfolded. It was only much later that I understood why. The legal challenge proceeded on 2 fronts. The first was the diminished capacity argument, the claim that Richard, in the final years of his illness, had not been fully competent to make estate decisions, and that the will, therefore, did not reflect his true intentions. The second, which emerged somewhat later and was in some ways more troubling, was an argument that I had exerted undue influence over Richard in his final months, that I had in essence manipulated a dying man into structuring his estate in a way that unfairly benefited me at the expense of his children. I want you to sit with that for a moment. My children accused me, in a legal document filed in the Superior Court of Los Angeles County, of manipulating my husband of 38 years into leaving me my own home, and a controlling interest in a company that I had helped build from nothing, at the expense of 3 adults who had already received the best of everything their entire lives, and stood to inherit many millions of dollars regardless. I sat in Margaret Chen's office when she read me the filing, and I felt, for perhaps the first time since all of this had begun, something crack inside me. Not grief exactly. Something older and harder than grief. The kind of pain that comes from a fundamental betrayal of trust. The trust that a mother places in her children, which is one of the most total and unguarded forms of trust that exists, because it is built from the very beginning, before the children even have faces, and it persists through everything, through disappointments and arguments, and the 1,000 small failures of understanding that accumulate over a lifetime. because it is rooted in something that feels, right up until the moment it proves not to be, as fundamental and unquestionable as gravity. Margaret waited until I was quiet again. Then she said, "Are you ready to fight?" "I have been ready for 14 months, I said. The court proceedings took 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, my children's attorneys deposed me for 9 hours over 2 days, asking questions designed to portray me as a controlling, manipulative presence who had isolated Richard from his children in his final months. A narrative that required ignoring the fact that Daniel, Claire, and Nathan had all visited their father regularly throughout his illness, had been present and involved, and welcomed without reservation. The attorneys had expert witnesses, a psychologist who had never met Richard, reviewing records, offering opinions about his cognitive state in his final years that were, as Margaret methodically dismantled them, based on incomplete data and significant misrepresentation. I sat through all of it. I sat through the insinuations and the legal language and the occasional glimpse I would get, across whatever room we happened to be in, of my children watching me with expressions I could not always read. I sat through the moment, during a deposition, when Daniel's attorney suggested that I had curated Richard's access to his children in the final weeks of his life. A suggestion so grotesque that I had to grip the edge of the deposition table to keep myself from responding in a way that would have been satisfying and professionally unwise. I sat through Claire, in her own deposition, describing our family dynamic in terms that bore no relationship to any family I recognized, recasting 30 years of memory into something darker and more self-serving. I had to remind myself many times of the envelope. I had retrieved it from the safe in Richard's study on the morning after Daniel's first phone call with his attorney. The morning I had sat in his chair in the library and heard my son planning to contest his father's will. I had held it for a long time. I had almost opened it then. But something had stopped me. Some instinct, or perhaps the memory of Richard's voice saying, "You'll know when the time is right." I had put it in my own safe, in my own study, and I had left it there for 6 weeks, while the lawyers argued and the depositions dragged on, and my children dismantled the story of our family in court documents. The day before the final hearing, I took it out and held it again. I still did not open it. I put it in the inside pocket of my jacket, and I carried it with me to court the next morning. And I sat down at the long wooden table, and I folded my hands in my lap, and I listened to the fluorescent lights hum. Margaret touched my arm. "Ready?" "Yes," I said. The hearing began with arguments from Daniel's attorneys, the same arguments that had been made for 6 weeks. Refined now into their most polished form, organized into a narrative that was coherent and specific, and almost completely false. Diminished capacity, undue influence, a will that did not reflect Richard Caldwell's true intentions. The children, portrayed as devoted and concerned, seeking only what their father would have genuinely wanted. I watched the judge. Her name was the Honorable Patricia Okafor, and she had been on the bench for 17 years, and her face throughout the presentation was exactly as readable as a closed book. Then Margaret stood up. "Your Honor," she said in the quiet, precise voice that I had come to think of as her working voice, the voice she used when she was absolutely certain of what she was doing. "The respondent would like to introduce one additional piece of evidence which has not previously been submitted to this court." Daniel's attorney was on his feet immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. Any evidence should have been submitted during the discovery period." "This evidence," Margaret said, still in that quiet voice, "was not available during the discovery period, as it was sealed by the decedent himself with instructions that it be opened only in circumstances that, as of the date of discovery, had not yet materialized. She paused. Those circumstances have now materialized. She looked at me. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. My hands were steady. I was surprised by that. I had expected them to shake. But they did not shake. I took out the envelope with its red wax seal and the letter R, and I held it up so the judge could see it, and then I placed it on the table in front of Margaret. The room was very quiet. "What is that?" Daniel said. Not to his attorney. To me, directly, across the table. His voice had a quality I had never heard in it before. Something between anger and fear. I looked at my son. I looked at him for a long moment, long enough for him to see that I was not the woman he had decided I was. Not the grieving widow. Not the woman too lost and weak to react. Not the woman who did not understand what was happening around her. "It's a letter," I said, "from your father." Margaret broke the seal. Inside the envelope were 3 documents. The first was a letter, 4 pages long, handwritten in Richard's distinctive architectural script. The letters tall and precise, always slightly right-leaning. It was dated November 12th, 15 years ago, and it was addressed, "To whoever needs to read this." Margaret read it aloud. "I am going to tell you what was in that letter. I am going to tell you all of it, because it deserves to be told in full, because Richard deserved to have his words heard, and because what he wrote in those 4 pages was the most complete and honest accounting of a life and a marriage and a family that I have ever encountered. He began with Jennifer. He described our marriage with a precision and a tenderness that made the room very still. Not the romantic generalities of a eulogy, but specific, observed true things. The way I worked through problems, the conversations we had had at that kitchen table in Koreatown, the specific contributions I had made to the company in its earliest years, the quality of attention I had brought to our children and our life. He wrote about my law degree, which I had completed quietly, which almost no one outside our marriage knew about, and about my investment portfolio, and about the years of careful joint planning that had gone into the structure of the estate. He wrote, "Jennifer is not a woman who needs to be protected. She is a woman who chose, at several points in her life, to direct her considerable abilities toward building a family and a home, rather than a public career, because that was what she valued and what she chose. That choice should not be mistaken by anyone for a lack of capability or awareness. Anyone who makes that mistake will regret it." Then he turned to the children. He wrote about Daniel first. He wrote about the private lunches with the company's legal team, which he had known about. Richard had known about almost everything. I was realizing in a way that I was only now beginning to fully understand. He wrote about a specific incident 3 years before his diagnosis, when Daniel had attempted to restructure his own compensation package within the company in a way that would have given him effective operational control while bypassing the board, an attempt that Richard had shut down quietly and completely, and which had never been discussed openly within the family. He wrote about his love for his eldest son, real and unqualified, and about his deep concern that Daniel had over the years come to prioritize inheritance over integrity in a way that Richard took responsibility for and deeply regretted. He wrote about Claire, her intelligence, her warmth when she allowed it to show, and the gradual troubling way she had come to see relationships primarily in terms of what they yielded. He wrote about a conversation he had had with her 6 months before his diagnosis, in which she had asked him, with careful indirectness, how the estate was structured, and had expressed views about her mother's role that Richard had found both revealing and heartbreaking. He wrote about Nathan. This was the section that surprised me most. He wrote that of his 3 children, Nathan was the one he worried about most deeply, not because of any calculated self-interest, but because of his passivity, his tendency to align himself with power rather than with principle, to drift in the direction of least resistance, and then live with the consequences in quiet misery. He wrote that he believed Nathan was capable of much more than he demanded of himself, and that he hoped his youngest son would find, sooner rather than later, the courage to make choices based on his own conscience rather than his siblings' expectations. The letter concluded with this: I have structured my estate as I have for reasons that are legally sound, morally defensible, and deeply considered. I trust Jennifer completely and without reservation. I ask that my wishes be honored, and I ask my children, whatever has happened, whatever choices have been made, whatever has been said or done in the weeks or months before this letter is being read, I ask my children to remember that the love their mother and I have for them is real and permanent and unconnected to any of this. It does not change what is right, but I want them to know it. The room was silent for a very long time after Margaret finished reading. The second document was a psychiatric evaluation of Richard, conducted by one of the most respected neuropsychologists in the United States, dated 14 months before his death, the week following his cancer diagnosis. The evaluation was thorough, detailed, and absolutely unambiguous. Richard Thomas Caldwell, at the time of the evaluation, and by every measurable standard, was of completely sound mind. No cognitive impairment, no diminished capacity, no susceptibility to undue influence. The evaluation had been conducted in anticipation of exactly the legal challenge that had just been presented to the court. Richard had known. He had prepared. The third document was a notarized affidavit signed by Richard, witnessed by 2 attorneys and a notary public, affirming that the estate plan as written reflected his complete, unambiguous, freely made wishes, and specifically noting that any future challenge to the will on grounds of diminished capacity or undue influence should be understood as precisely contrary to his intentions. I watched my children as Margaret laid each document on the table. I watched Daniel's face go through several stages. Disbelief, then a rapid recalculation, then something that was very close to shame, though he would not have called it that. I watched Claire's careful composure finally, genuinely crack, not with grief but with the particular shock of someone who has been completely outmaneuvered by a person they had fundamentally underestimated. Her eyes came to mine and stayed there for a long moment, and in them, I saw something I had not seen in a very long time. She saw me, the real me, for perhaps the first time in her adult life. And Nathan put his head in his hands. Judge Okafor reviewed the documents for 22 minutes. I counted. Then she looked up. In the matter of the estate of Richard Thomas Caldwell, she said, in the measured tone of someone who has spent 17 years making pronouncements that change people's lives, the court finds that the challenge to the validity of the will has no merit. The evidence presented by the respondent is conclusive and overwhelming. The decedent's estate plan will stand as written. She paused. I would additionally note for the record that this court finds the conduct of the petitioners in bringing this challenge to be deeply troubling. The decedent clearly anticipated this challenge and prepared extensively for it. His wishes were clear. This proceeding should not have been necessary. She looked at Daniel and Claire. The petition is dismissed, she said, with prejudice. Daniel's attorney was already leaning in, speaking in a low, urgent voice. Daniel was not listening to him. He was looking at me, and his face, that face with his father's jaw and his grandfather's calculating eyes. His face had something in it that I had not seen there since he was very young, since before he had learned to want things and measure the distance between himself and them. He looked for just a moment, like a child. I held his gaze. Outside the courthouse, in the hard white light of a Los Angeles afternoon, Margaret and I stood on the steps while the legal teams dispersed around us. The palm trees along the street moved in a slow, indifferent breeze. Somewhere nearby a car alarm was going off and then stopped. "How do you feel?" Margaret asked. I thought about it honestly. "Tired," I said, "and sad. And something else. Something that isn't quite relief but is close to it." Margaret nodded. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "He was a remarkable man." "Yes," I said, "he was." I walked to my car alone. I sat in the driver's seat for a while without starting the engine. I held my phone in my hands and I thought about calling my children, all three of them, and saying something. I didn't know what. Something true and necessary, and possibly unkind, or possibly kind, in the way that only hard truths can be kind. I put the phone down and drove home. That evening, as the sun was going down over Bel Air, and the city below was beginning to light up in that way it does at dusk. Millions of separate lights against the gathering dark, each one a life, each one its own particular story. I sat in the garden where Richard and I had spent so many evenings, and I allowed myself to feel the full weight of everything that had happened. The grief of losing him was still there, enormous and real, and it would be there for a long time. That kind of love does not end. It simply changes shape. It becomes part of the architecture of who you are, load-bearing, essential, and you carry it the way you carry everything that has truly mattered, not as a burden, but as a foundation. The grief of what my children had done was there too, and that was a different kind, more complicated, more resistant to easy resolution, because they were still my children. Daniel with his father's jaw and his ambition that had curdled somewhere along the way from admirable to something else. Claire with her intelligence and her calculated warmth. Nathan, adrift and passive and, I believed, genuinely remorseful in a way that his siblings were not yet capable of. I loved them. That had not changed. But love and trust are not the same thing, and trust, once broken in the particular way theirs had been broken, does not simply reconstitute itself because a judge dismisses a petition. That is the hardest truth I have to tell you, and I want to tell it plainly, without softening it. The story did not end in the courthouse with a clean reconciliation and a return to how things were. That is not what happened. That kind of ending belongs in movies, and this is not a movie. What happened instead was this. In the weeks following the hearing, I received calls from all three of my children. Daniel's call came first. 4 days after the hearing, brief and stiff, an apology that was technically correct in its form and largely devoid of genuine feeling. I accepted it because I am 66 years old, and I have learned that acceptance is not the same as absolution, and that you can receive something graciously without pretending it is more than it is. Claire called a week later, and her call was longer and more difficult and, I thought, more honest. She cried, which Claire almost never does, and she said things that I believed she actually meant, even if I also believed she had said them in part because she had had 10 days to calculate the advantages of repair over continued conflict. I accepted that call too, for the same reasons. Nathan called me on a Sunday morning, 3 weeks after the hearing. He did not apologize immediately. He asked if he could come over. I said yes. He sat in the garden where I had sat the night of the hearing, and he told me something that I had not known, that 3 months before his father's death, Richard had called him, not Daniel, not Claire, but Nathan, and had told him, quietly and directly, that he knew what the others were planning, and that he was asking Nathan to make a choice, not to act against his siblings, simply to step away from it, to refuse to participate. Nathan had been unable to do that, he told me. He had been too afraid of Daniel's anger, too accustomed to following his siblings' lead, too lacking in the particular courage that his father had identified and mourned in the letter. He had not participated actively, but he had not stepped away. He sat in my garden and told me this with his hands between his knees and his eyes very red, and he said, "Dad told me I would regret it. He was right." I looked at my youngest son for a long time. "What do you want now?" I asked him, not unkindly. "I don't know," he said. "I think I want to figure out who I actually am. Without—" he gestured vaguely in the direction of his siblings. "Without all of that." I reached over and put my hand on his arm. "Your father believed you could," I said. "So do I. That is where we are now. Caldwell Capital continues. I hold my 51%. Daniel holds his shares and remains in his operational role, which he executes with the same competence he has always had. His professional capabilities were never the issue. We are cordial. We are professional. We are not right now what I would call close. Perhaps we will be again one day. I do not know. Claire has a board seat and a significant investment portfolio and a great deal of explaining to do to herself. The kind of explaining that does not happen in court or in a phone call to your mother, but in the private hours of a life when the justifications run out and what's left is just the unadorned truth of what you chose and why. I believe she is doing that explaining. I believe it is hard for her. I am willing to be patient. Nathan has started therapy. He told me this himself matter-of-factly, as though it were a practical measure rather than a profound one, which is exactly how he would approach it. He has also reduced his dependence on Caldwell Capital referrals, and has, in the past few months, brought in 3 clients entirely through his own efforts. When he told me, he seemed surprised by himself. I was not surprised at all. And me. I live in the house in Bel Air. I sit in the garden in the evenings when the light is right. I manage the company, attend board meetings, make decisions. I have Margaret Chen on speed dial, which I intend to keep. I miss Richard every single day, with an intensity that does not diminish, and that I have stopped expecting to diminish, because it is not a wound to be healed, but a measure of what we had, and I would not trade the weight of it for anything. There is a thing that people say about grief, and about betrayal, and about the hard passages of a life, that they change you. This is true, but incomplete. They do not only change you, they also, if you survive them with your integrity intact, clarify you. They burn away the things that were never quite solid and leave what remains, what was always there, load-bearing and essential, waiting to be seen. What I know now, on the other side of all of this, is something that Richard knew and tried to tell me in the kitchen on that evening with the untouched bourbon. That love is real, and that love and judgment are not the same thing, and that you can love your children completely and still see them clearly, and that seeing them clearly is not a failure of love, but the deepest form of it, and that a marriage of 38 years, built in honesty and mutual respect, and the particular shared language of 2 people who have been through everything together, is a kind of fortress. Not impenetrable. Nothing is impenetrable. But solid in ways that outlast the people who built it. Solid enough to protect the things that matter most when everything else is falling apart. Richard built that fortress with me. Every decision we ever made together, every careful arrangement, every sealed envelope and signed affidavit and quietly completed law degree, all of it was part of it. He saw clearly for a very long time, and he trusted me to see clearly too. He was right. He was always right. I am sitting in the garden now, as I finish telling you this story. The city is beginning to come alight below me. Somewhere a coyote is calling. You can hear them from this garden sometimes, which always surprises people, and does not surprise me anymore, because that is one of the things you learn from living in a place for a long time. What sounds belong to it. The bougainvillea along the east wall is coming into bloom, orange and violent and impossibly beautiful against the evening sky. Richard planted that bougainvillea 20 years ago. He said it would take a long time to really establish itself, and it did. It took almost a decade before it bloomed properly, and in those early years it was scraggly and tentative and not particularly promising. But he watered it, and tended it, and did not give up on it, and now it is one of the most extraordinary things in the garden. I think about that sometimes. I want to end by telling you something directly, because I think it matters, and because I have always believed that the truth is better spoken plainly than dressed up in prettier clothes. If you are watching this, and you are in the middle of a situation that feels impossible, if someone you love is betraying you, if people you trusted are trying to take something from you, if you feel invisible, or dismissed or underestimated by the people who should know you best, I want you to hear this. Do not show them your hand before you are ready. Do not defend yourself before you have the evidence. Do not react from pain when you can act from preparation. And do not ever, ever mistake someone's stillness for weakness. The most powerful thing I did in the 18 months between Richard's diagnosis and that courtroom was to sit quietly and pay attention and let my children believe I was exactly who they had decided I was, a woman too overwhelmed by grief to know what was happening around her. I knew exactly what was happening around me. I had always known. The lesson is not that money is worth fighting for, although sometimes it is. The lesson is not that you should distrust your children, although sometimes, and with great sorrow, you must. The lesson is simpler and harder than either of those. It is that the people who love you, who truly love you, the way Richard loved me, do not only love you in the good years. They build for you in the hard years. They anticipate the storms. They seal the envelope. Find those people, be those people. Hold what they give you. That is everything. If this story moved you, please take a second right now to hit the like button. It costs you nothing, and it means the world to this channel. Subscribe if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell so you never miss a story. And please, leave me a comment. Tell me what part of this stayed with you. Tell me if you've been through something like this. Tell me what you would have done. I read every single one. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. This one was for Richard.